This time in the Magic Kitchen, we are joined by author Steele, Alexandra, Douris to discuss spiritualism.
I'm Leandra Witchwood.
And I'm Elise Wells.
And welcome to the Magic Kitchen podcast, where we talk about magic, kitchen witchcraft, herbs,
and everything in between.
As you may know, the Magic Kitchen podcast is fully and independently funded by the Witchwood Tea House. So show us some support and head over to thewitchwoodteahouse.com to purchase some deliciously hand-blended loose leaf teas or one of my other botanical products. As a special thank you for your support, please use POD 15 at checkout to take 15% off of your next order. So without any further ado, let's get to the episode. Blessed be.
Steele Alexandra Douris is an author and PhD candidate in the English department at Stanford University, where she has taught courses on Victorian spiritualism, ghost stories, and the Gothic novel. She holds an MA in English from Stanford University and a BA in anthropology from the University of Texas at Austin. Welcome, Steele. It's really good to have you here.
Yeah, welcome.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me.
I think we both we really liked your book. Like I'm showing you guys, you can't see it on the podcast, of course, but I have like all of these tabs in the book of things like, oh, that was interesting. Oh, I want to go back and read more about that. And
thank you.
It was fun.
Yeah, I am especially impressed from an academic standpoint, the way you were able to take such a vast subject and condense it into exactly 200 pages. Like that really feels like a award-winning feat, honestly. And I felt like this book was the perfect first, like baby's first Victorian spiritualism book, because I've read a few others and they either have this like overtone of like expecting that you know more than you do, or they don't really touch on all of it, or they touch on it from like a very like, this was how those silly Victorians did things perspective. And yours is very approachable. It's very welcoming and it's active. Like I love that you had ways that people could use these Victorian spiritualist components and tools in, if they wanted to, in their own practice.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, when I first got the idea for the book, I was doing academic research. I was doing research at school, and I had no idea how many like periodicals, I talk about this in the book, but how many journals, how many periodicals, how many books, how many handbooks, pamphlets, like they were crazy prolific, the spiritualists. And I just had no idea like the masses of documents and texts that were out there from the spiritualist movement. And so I think when I was coming up for the book, I just had this sense that, you know, I wanted to show the other side of spiritualism that, you know, in our modern media, a lot of times we just see like the seance scene, you know, in a movie, in a film, we have a very dramatic seance scene, which I love those, you know, I love Gothic horror. But I wanted to sort of show all these other aspects of the movement as well. And also just to hopefully like connect spiritualism and these other things that you hear about from the Victorian era, like fairies or fortune telling or the Gothic novel. So that was a big part of what made me want to write the book in the first place.
Yeah. And I loved being able to see how you demonstrate how a lot of our modern practices, a lot of modern beliefs, a lot of perspectives stem from the Victorian work, how they, you know, like in chapter 1, you talk about benevolent spirits and, you know, going into, you know, these exorcist level evil, you know, how they're warned, how newbies are warned against it and that sort of thing. And it brought me to thinking like, well, okay, then that makes sense of the perfect love and perfect trust that is integrated into the Wiccan traditions. Like you have to go in a circle with perfect love and perfect trust, the people around you, the spirits you're working with.
Yeah.
And it just echoes, which I'm sure it's not exclusively a Victorian idea. They got it from somewhere, but it really helped me like understand a little bit clearer of why we do some of the things we do.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really interesting when I was reading about, the first spiritualist spirit communications. First of all, I had no idea the idea of a spirit guide was so old, because you see that so much on social media. And for some reason, before I did all of this research, I thought that was more of a 1940s to 1970s on kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So reading, people from the 1860s talking about their guides or their spirit guides, I was like, that could be an Instagram post now. That's crazy. So, and then that idea of, they had there were these debates within the spiritualist community about like the kind of safety of spirit communication, whether you could trust the spirits. And that was something they were, very interested in talking about. And most of the prominent spiritualists, they would constantly, as you were saying, sort of redirect it to, well, who's in the circle and what energy are they bringing to the circle? What are the people in the circle actually like? Which is, again, something that you see in Wicca, you see moving forwards as well, which is really, really cool.
It's definitely something that I use within my practice. Who are you with? What energies are they bringing? And when somebody comes to me and they're saying, well, I'm cursed and I need you to help me lift this curse. Okay, what are you doing to proliferate or perpetuate that curse? And they don't like that question, but it's valid. So this is kind of, that it helped just kind of solidify that belief, because I never really understood where it came from. I just understood it. And this was like, oh, well, okay, if they, this is bigger and older than I expected.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that was really fascinating is that the 19th century was also the century that scientists and people in general were developing these theories of the unconscious, right? And so the idea that some part of your mind could be working towards something or hold a belief or, that's sort of submerged that you're not fully aware of, but there's this other kind of force at work in your mind. And that was something that existed like outside of the spiritualist communities as well. And like, medical communities, psychiatric communities, that kind of thing. So, and I think that's also, I was also into just like the academic history and like when different fields sort of consolidated.
Yeah. Well, and you talk frequently in the book about how the new technologies that were coming up, how they were being used for the spiritualist practices, but also they were kind of, I don't know, they were not really excited about the new practices or the new technologies within just their culture, how they were being separated from the natural world. And I appreciated that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, technology in the Victorians, it's really interesting because when I was first researching the book, there's this cottagecore is like a huge aesthetic now, all of these Victorian-esque aesthetics. And it's really interesting because a lot of times within those aesthetics, like cottagecore, witchy, there's this move away from technology. So there's this sense of the Victorians as like a time before technology or go analog and be Victorian. But it is funny because the Victorians, a lot of the spiritualists were really into, as soon as a new technology came out, they were like, how can we use this to contact the spirits? Like immediately, what's the like spiritualist psychic potential of this technology? And so,
exactly. It's kind of funny because there's a few just like misconceptions I think that your book really debunks in the best way. Like one is that that Victorians were Luddites and they hated technology, and that spirituality is inherently the old ways. Like we still use that term. We're like, oh, the old ways. Like I won't use electricity. I'll use, beeswax candles, handmade, blah, blah, blah. Like the Victorians would have been like, oh, you have a cell phone? Like, is there an app you can download that could help me?
Exactly.
And then the other one, like we were saying a bit, is this idea that like we had the Satanic Panic 100 years after the Victorians about like, oh, you don't know, you could accidentally invite a demon into your home and it could eat your babies. Like the Victorians actually, like I loved this quote. When spiritualist leaders warned of the existence of malicious spirits, they didn't usually have exorcist level evil in mind, but rather the human capacity for mischief and malice. So like the idea that like during a seance, somebody might like, say boo or something.
Yeah.
Like it really wasn't like, oh my God, they're going to possess her.
Yeah, exactly. Most of the time, one of my favorite quotes, I don't know actually if it made it, and it might have been too long. I might have cut it from the book, but a lot of the spiritualists, they would just sort of talk a lot about this idea of like, do you trust every person you meet the second you meet them? No. Well, then why would you feel the same way about spirits, right? Like, why would you assume that, someone means you wouldn't do that with a person? Don't do it with the spirits. And so there's some really interesting quotes where they're comparing like, exploring the spirit realm to like exploring London for the first time, big industrialized London, and being like, would you wander through there and trust everyone? No, you would use common sense. Same with the spirit realm. And it's so Victorian, and I love it.
Well, it's funny because I feel like those are quote unquote revelations that people make today, where they're like, spirits are just like humans in a way. Like, you can just decide to trust them, or you have to build a relationship before you command them to do things for you or whatever. And it's like, we've already known this, it's just interesting the way we've forgotten. And you mentioned a bit about Borderlands and the other spiritual publications. I write for different pagan and witchcraft magazines today, and they're really growing. There's a lot of pagan and witchcraft magazines. So I found that parallel really interesting. Could you tell our audience just a bit about spiritualist publications, what they were like and what readers expected from them at the time?
Absolutely. There were a ton. One of the biggest ones, Medium and Daybreak, was a huge one. Banner of Light was, I think, the longest running like spiritualist publication. Banner of Light was run out of the United States. Borderland is kind of my favorite. It's one of the not to be biased, but I do have a favorite. I spent way too much time with them. So I have a favorite. Borderland is my favorite. It's the one I draw on the most. Borderland is British, and it's from the 1880s. And that's partly just I have a slight bias towards the 1880s, like the 1880s and the 1890s, or like if I had to pick decades from the Victorian era, I'm a little biased towards the 80s and 90s. So, but over the course of, since the first spiritualist publications were really in the 1850s, and then, they were still publishing a lot of them until the first decades of the 20th century, there were just a lot of different kind of motivations behind them. So Borderland, the one that I talk about the most, had this vision. At the time Borderland was founded, the Society for Paranormal Research, which is still running today, had been founded in London. But it was very exclusive in a way. It was meant for like top spiritualists and sort of top skeptics. The vision was top spiritualists and top skeptics would like work together to investigate. It was not exactly that simple. That didn't always go according to plan. But the editor of Borderland felt like, he wanted sort of the common people, to the average spiritualist, to be able to have the benefit of hearing about kind of the debates and what was being published inside the Society for Paranormal Research. And so he envisioned Borderland as kind of an opportunity for people to get access to the like research and debates that were coming out of the SPR, basically. Some of the others, the earlier ones, like Banner of Light, another interesting thing about them is that, again, like a side of spiritualism I never saw in the movies, but like they would hold regular circles, like weekly circles, the way you'd hold like a quilting circle or something, or a sewing circle. Like they'd meet every Thursday for 2 hours or something. And so part of what these periodicals were doing, besides sort of sharing news and information, is they would also publish lists of circles and where they were meeting. So you'll see at the back, like spirit circles. And so they'll tell you, like in Philadelphia, like they meet Tuesday evenings, like 8 p.m. at this location. Boston, they're meeting, here. And so they were really a way for people to, they could subscribe to one of these and they could get all of this kind of information, tips, things like that. But they could also find out how to like get involved locally, basically.
That's cool.
That is cool.
Yeah, it's like the early pagan magazines too.
Right.
Like I always love listening to like elders of the craft talk about how they found their groups and community. And that's almost always the case, is they found it at the back of a magazine they happened to find at this one bookstore. Yeah. Yeah, a little later. Yeah, like I was listening to some interviews with like proto druids, like people in the 70s, and they were like, that's it. That's all we had was these very limited magazines.
Yeah.
Real talk.
Leandra and I could be trying to sell you socks or a VPN or that cereal everybody talks about, but we like to keep it witchy around here instead. And we can only do that because of the support of listeners like you. When you're joining my magical living community on Patreon, you're not only getting weekly shadow work journal prompts, new moon and full moon rituals, exclusive videos, exclusive meditations, plus bonus episodes of the Magic Kitchen podcast, but you're seriously keeping the lights on in the Magic Kitchen. Thank you for listening and reviewing the show. And if you're ready to meet me in the Magic Kitchen, pop over to patreon.com/Elise Wells and start your free trial. Let's deepen your magical practice together.
I'm like amazed at like how old some of these practices are. So one of my certifications is in NLP, which is, I guess, modern hypnosis. And you talk about mesmerism and hypnotism. And I knew about beard or braid. But I didn't know about the mesmerism movement. And I was, Dr. Franz. And can you talk a little bit about that? Like how was it used?
Sure. Absolutely. So first we had mesmerism. So mesmerism comes from Dr. Franz Mesmer, which is, I had no idea he's literally Dr. Mesmer. It's like so cool. But Dr. Mesmer was 18th century, Austrian, I think. I'm forgetting now, Austrian or Swiss. I've forgotten already. The research is leaching from my brain. But Dr. Mesmer he's the one who started a theory of, we call it mesmerism now. When he first started talking about it, he called it frequently magnetism or animal magnetism, which is funny because I feel like when I hear that term now, a lot of times it's more like someone who's very charismatic or something, like they have animal magnetism. But at the time, it was sort of interchangeable with mesmerism. He called it animal magnetism, and then it sort of became called mesmerism. And his idea was basically that there's this his original theory was that there was like this invisible, magnetized fluid that moved through people's bodies. And this is very much coming out of earlier centuries, these ideas that anytime something's wrong with you, there's like a fluid, one of the fluids is so he's very much sort of picking up on that idea. Yeah, the humors, exactly. Like too much phlegm. That's it. Just too much, and the ideas about bleeding and all of that. So they were very interested in kind of levels of fluid in the human body and a lot of the work that was being done then. But his idea was that certain people, and he counted himself among them, had a degree of animal magnetism that would allow them to, by passing their hands over people's bodies, sort of unblock this magnetic fluid that had become blocked in certain places or trapped in certain places, and sort of restore the healthy natural flow of this magnetized fluid through the human body. So that was his kind of original idea. And he was sort of at the center of a lot of scandals kind of from the beginning, because he had some people he was able to really help, and then he had some people who thought he was a fraud. And so he was a very flamboyant kind of personality. He had a lot of high profile successes, but then there were also people trying to debunk him. So he was another really lively character. But mesmerism became really interesting to a lot of people, spread across Europe, became popular in the United States, very popular in the UK. Charles Dickens was fascinated by mesmerism. He actually tried practicing mesmerism on his family members. He thought he was pretty good at it. So Charles Dickens is a funny character because he was not very into the spiritualist stuff, but he was very into mesmerism. So he had his things he was into. In the 19th century, some doctors who saw themselves as sort of, we would say now, not woo-woo, basically, but they didn't necessarily identify with Dr. Mesmer. They didn't necessarily identify with the spiritualists, but they were really fascinated by trance states. And so by the 19th century, mesmerists, one of the things they would do is they were magnetically working on someone as the person would enter a trance. And that became important in spiritualism because a lot of the channeled communication in seances and things like that, it was through a trance state. So spiritualism really picked up on mesmeric practice because they were interested in, communicating in a trance state. Hypnotists like Dr. Braid, they were interested. They were, again, not really, a lot of them were not into spirits. They were not into that sort of thing, but they did believe that there was something going on. They were very intrigued by the trance state. And so what Braid was trying to do, and he wrote he wrote this book. What did he call it? They didn't call it hypnotism at first. They called it neurohypnology or something really hideous. So his book is like neurohypnology, which is his original term for hypnotism, which is horrible. And I'm glad it fell out of favor. But he was writing, I think, in the 1840s. And he was very interested in how can you achieve that trance state without, crediting spirits or anything like that, kind of moving away from what he saw as kind of like, the woo-woo of mesmerism. He wanted to kind of medicalize it in a way. And, and so he's sort of an interesting character because he's drawing on a lot of the things that are coming out of, mesmerism and these movements. But he's very emphatic in his book about like people need to see medical men. He uses that term like medical men, like if they're going to receive this kind of treatment, we need like responsible medical men running things. But you do sort of see like that branch off into hypnotism. A lot of times it's being championed by these like medical men. And you see that later with Freud. Freud was into hypnotism for a while and then sort of moved in another direction. But it was this sense of like, the medical men kind of trying to put their own sort of spin on some of the practices that they were drawing on. Yeah.
It's interesting because they were onto something, like maybe not completely, but they were onto something, because if we look at the work that the Heart Math group has been doing and how they realized and discovered that your heart has its own electromagnetic field and it has its own neural pathways in it. So it's like a second brain in your body. So they were onto something. They knew something was going on, but they just didn't quite have the technology to fully identify it, I guess. And it's really interesting to look back and see like, okay, you're on the right track here. You're onto something. Like maybe our next step is with dark matter and dark energy. Who knows?
Yeah, and it's really fascinating, like all of the different facets, because you've got like the mesmerists, and then spiritualists are experimenting with mesmerism, the hypnotists are doing their own thing. And you have, I don't know as much about some of the occult groups, but you've got like the theosophists, theosophy is doing. And so they're all sort of trading ideas back and forth, but they have very different theories a lot of times about like where these things are actually coming from, what they actually mean. And so it's interesting to watch how they like influence each other throughout the century. Yeah.
And actually, maybe now's a good time to define spiritualism, because sometimes you'll see people use that as a hashtag or something, and they're just talking about spirituality. But spiritualism is different. And then there's spiritism as well.
Yeah.
If you want to just give our audience like a couple definitions for those different terms.
Absolutely. So spiritual, let's see. The first thing I would say, so spiritualism, let me give my usual little piece on this. So the spiritualists didn't invent spirit communication. That's the first thing that I try to talk about in the book. So most cultures, all cultures that I'm aware of across history, have had the idea that you can communicate with some form of spirit. Sometimes it's deities, sometimes it's spirits of the land, sometimes it's spirits of the dead. But spiritualism itself, what we call spiritualism, originated in 1848 in Hydesville, New York, with the Fox family farmhouse. And in the Fox family farmhouse, basically, to make it very brief, the Fox family moved into this farmhouse. It was an old farmhouse. It had a reputation for being kind of weird at the time that they moved in. And two of their young daughters, who were about 12 and 14 at the time, pretty soon after the family moved in, basically reported that they were able to communicate with some kind of spirit in the farmhouse via like rapping sounds. So they could like spell out the alphabet, and they would hear knocks at certain letters. And so as time went on, there were sort of like increasingly complicated kinds of spirit communication. Like at first it was like knock for yes, no, and then eventually words were being spelled out. And so that at the time, like spirit communication, again, was not unprecedented in the area. There were Hydesville, New York, they called it the burned over district at the time. There had been so many like revivals. There were Quakers in the area, Shakers in the area. The Swedenborgians were interested in kind of spirit communication. But with most of those groups, it was usually a specific, first of all, they were sometimes more interested in angels than spirits of the dead. And also it wasn't usually something that like everyone or anyone could do. What happened starting with the Fox family farmhouse was this idea that basically all humans had the potential for mediumship or, psychic ability or spirit communication. But some people were naturally a bit better at it, but anyone could kind of cultivate it. And spiritualism was really set apart from a lot of other things because there was very little focus on hierarchy. Like if you look at occult societies like Theosophy, they're very interested in hierarchy, initiation, rites, all of those kinds of things. But spiritualism was, in a weird way, like extremely democratic. They were like, you can do it and you can do it. Try at home. Try with your mother. You can hold a seance in your living room. So this kind of sense of like slowly entering into mysteries or looking to a higher authority, they were very into like grassroots spirit communication. And so what took off from there was this culture of kind of like, we're all investigators. We can all explore the spirit realm, and a really strong influence on sort of this communication that's not like you have a dream and an angel appears to you and gives you advice, but literally you can communicate back and forth with kind of a deceased relative in a seance, which was that was pretty unprecedented at the time. So let's see, what else was I going to, I think I covered, is that what?
Yeah. That's it. I mean, I think so many people think of it as just like even, I mean, words only describe so much anyway, but like there's druidry and druidism, so like spirituality, I think people think spiritualism is like a synonym for that. But it's not, it's this rich, vibrant community that is sort of kind of still around. Like I'm eager if there's any listeners who are spiritualists by trade, like they consider themselves spiritualists, because that's the other thing. There wasn't a religious component. I guess part of that democratic flair you're referencing was that they didn't talk much about like, the Christian. I mean, that was definitely an overlay to everything, but it wasn't like they weren't focused on sin, for example. They weren't like, there wasn't that pressure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It was interesting how different spiritualists kind of connected spiritualism to other religions. Like some of them were Christian, they identified as Christian, and they saw spiritualism as part of that in some way. Some of them were more what we would call now like agnostics. Some of them saw spiritualism as their religion. Some of them were atheists, but they practiced spiritualism. So there was a lot of flexibility. Spiritualism really didn't like to turn people away. So there was a lot of flexibility in terms of like how you could choose to affiliate and like what spiritualism might mean in the context of like other beliefs that you held.
I think that's the cool part about it, is that it's not this dogmatic thing.
Yeah.
So it makes me wonder if like that's what led most modern views from the church to be like, oh, that's witchcraft, that's devil worship, like don't do that. Like,
yeah.
Makes me wonder.
Yeah, the church had a really complicated relationship, and different churches had different takes. But it's interesting reading some of them sound very current. It's like, oh, they're just obviously talking to devils. Not sure why they're doing that. And some of them were not so heavy-handed, but there was a lot of tension in general, as you would probably expect.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yes.
Hey there, witches. Did you know that there's an entire community out there dedicated to you and your journey? The Rebel Mystic community is a space where I offer my decades of knowledge and experience to witches just like you. I do this through live events, monthly mentoring, monthly rituals, a book club, and other resources like workbook pages and meditations. There is even a complete self-paced course library you can access. Check the link in the show notes to learn more about this community and how to become a member. Blessed be.
So let's talk about the Anatomy Act and the corpse trade. Speaking of the creepy aspects.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah, that would be out of the Gothic chapter. Oh, yeah. So I talk about sort of Victorian medicine a little bit in a few chapters. It comes up as well as in the trance healing chapter. But let's see, what year was the anatomy? I'm going to consult my own book here to remember what year the Anatomy Act was. But basically, probably a good way to start is with Frankenstein. for people who are familiar with Frankenstein, which is from, the very early 19th century, it's pre-Victorian, by Mary Shelley, there's this kind of, the doctor is going around and he's stealing bits and pieces from corpses to build his creature, basically. And the thing I think not everyone realizes about that is that actually in the early 19th century, there was a huge grave robbing problem in the UK. There was a massive grave robbing problem. And at the time, it was only the medical students, like medical students now, they were expected to work on cadavers. The problem was that at the time, like in the 19th century, almost nobody would like willingly donate their body to medicine. They were very interested in having their kind of Christian burial, and they were not really into that. So in the early decades of the 19th century, mainly what medical students were experimenting on were the bodies of people who had been executed. And then what started to happen in the 19th century is, in the UK at least, not talking about the United States here, but in the UK, executions began to drop dramatically. And that's something else that's really interesting about the 19th century. In the first couple decades of the 19th century, like 1800 to 1820, there were a ton of offenses that they would execute you for. By the end of the 19th century, it was pretty much just murder, and a lot of murderers still weren't getting executed. So there was just this dramatic drop off. And meanwhile, there were more and more doctors, like medicine was becoming more and more medicalized. There was this movement away from like midwives and kind of, there was that movement towards like everyone needs to see a medical man that like Braid was really into. So all of these new medical men, they needed more and more bodies to, work on. And there were fewer and fewer executions. So basically what was happening was resurrectionists, grave robbers, they called themselves resurrectionists, were just robbing graves, and they were stealing bodies, and they were selling them like fresh bodies to the medical schools and medical students who just didn't ask questions. They were like, look, 5 new bodies, great, wonderful. But people were really starting to freak out, for obviously, like nobody wants to bury someone and then their body gets stolen. So the way that they handled this, I forget the exact year, but the Anatomy Act was passed. And the issue with the Anatomy Act was that basically...
I see here, it's 1832.
1832, perfect. Yeah. 1832, really executions are dropping, more and more doctors. And so they passed the Anatomy Act. And in the Anatomy Act, basically, any unclaimed body that's not claimed by relatives who have the money to bury them will just be donated to medical schools, basically. Well, this meant that it was basically only the bodies of the poor, people who died in prisons, people who died in workhouses, people who died in paupers' hospitals, basically, like any of those. People who didn't have family members or whose family members couldn't get to them or pay the money to bury them in time. And so this was a massive scandal at the time. The middle class and the upper class were very for it because they were like, excellent. They'll stop robbing our graves. They can work on them instead. Like, we can bury people in peace. Yeah, no problems here. And the poor, especially since they were the least likely to be able to afford like medical treatment in the first place, like the skills that these doctors were learning, a lot of times the poor never saw the benefit of them anyway. The poor were really horrified by this law. It remained in effect for many decades anyway, though, because the lawmakers did not care. But I think there was a lot of, in the Gothic chapter, there's just, I'm talking a lot about like creepy medicine, the like shadow side of medicine, essentially in the Victorian era, and why it starts increasingly popping up in the Gothic. And that is a big part of it. There's this real push-pull between the public and these medical men in the 19th century, and things like the Anatomy Act were a big part of that.
And I love how you put into chapter 9, try it yourself, explore your own shadow. That is,
yeah,
I love it. But you also talk about the threat of asylum for Victorian women and how that became, I guess a solution in some ways to some of the problems. Yeah.
Yeah.
Justifications anyway.
Yeah, the thing that was frightening about the asylum in the 19th century, and this was true, it's always complicated because there's the UK, the laws in the UK, and then there's the laws in the United States, except all the states have different laws. So it's like you're working with like 14 different, many different legal systems. But in a lot of places in the US and in the UK at certain points as well, it was incredibly easy to commit, especially wives, for a husband to commit his wife. Like in a couple states in the United States, there would be rules about if you wanted to commit a family member, you needed to get like multiple doctors. I'm trying to remember. I don't remember the exact details, but you would have to get multiple doctors to sign off on it, except if you were a husband trying to commit your wife, and then it was like much easier. And this wasn't true in every state, but there were a few states in which it was true. And it was really terrifying, obviously, for women at the time. And there were several high-profile cases where women got just basically committed by husbands who had gotten tired of them or were fighting with them all the time, and really absolutely had to fight incredibly hard to get out. And a lot of them didn't. The stories that we have are from women who were able to get out. One of them, her name escapes me, but she had grown children at the time. And so her grown children were able to kind of work to try to get her out. She was able to be in communication with them. But for some of them who had no one on the outside to advocate for them, they could easily spend 20 years of their life in an asylum that they had been committed to because like their husband was tired of their attitude or something, essentially, literally.
Or else.
Yeah, exactly. That's also this kind of like claustrophobia and fear of like doctors and psychiatrists and psychologists becomes really important in the Gothic as well.
Yeah, tell our listeners a bit about that, because I know this is a little more literature and less specifically pointed towards spirituality, but I feel like it affects a lot of the way we view spirituality aesthetically as something we do at home, hearthcraft, and even our podcast, it's about the kitchen. Like, how does that kind of emerge in the Victorian era? Because I also study the Regency for a person. It's very much my hobby. But it's amazing to me how we go from like Elizabeth Bennet walking across the fields totally legally, not thrown in an asylum. And then all of a sudden it's like, she tried to order eggs without her husband's permission. And now she's in an asylum. Like, how did that happen?
So I think, let's see where to start. There were definitely, you could definitely institutionalize female family members in the 18th century as well. I think one of the things that happened in the 19th century, so starting with the Victorian era, really, as there's increased industrialization, there's this increased emphasis on domesticity and the cozy home, and home really as a sanctuary that like a working man retreats to, where his children are all, there, and his wife is there. And this sense of, what we might call now like your home as your castle, or kind of very similar in a way to what you see in the 1950s. If you think about like traditional
the cult of domesticity.
Yeah, exactly. Very similar to that in the sense of like, and part of that was because of that industrialization that they were facing increasingly throughout the 19th century, where there was this sense of, you're in big cities increasingly and they're polluted and there's all these strangers. The Victorians also were getting increasingly suspicious about like who their neighbors were and who they were surrounded by, which it sort of makes sense if you think about a lot of people, their families would have stayed in hamlets or villages where they'd been there forever and knew everyone. And then you relocate to these huge cities. It seems very anonymous, very threatening. And then at the same time, because of the industrialization, there's more and more factory goods. There's more and more kind of trinkets that you can put around your home and consumer goods that you can buy. And so sort of in response to this feeling that the city is like frightening and, threatening, and you want a safe place to return to. And then also there's so many factory goods. So you can sort of, like if you think about that classic kind of Victorian style, it's a very kind of maximalist, almost cluttery kind of style. So there's more stuff for you to keep in your home. And so there's this real focus on like domesticity, safety, home. But that put an enormous amount of pressure specifically on a lot of times middle class women. Now, obviously, working class women had a whole slate. They were, more challenged. But there was this sense of, because the Victorians were deeply classist, a lot of times working class women, they kind of wrote off in a way, and then upper class women could get away with more things. But there was this sense of the middle class mother, again, a lot like the 1950s. The middle class mother is the morality of the family. She's the angel in the home. It's her job to sort of keep everyone religious, to lead by example, to be perfect, to devote herself to her husband, and to devote herself to her children. And so there's this sense of like the middle class mother as like the moral compass for the nation in a way. And that puts an enormous amount of pressure to behave in very specific ways. And when you think about that classic picture of like Victorian repression, it's a lot of times this sense of like, good Victorian mothers behave a certain way. And you see that in like the fiction of Charles Dickens, like his good women and his bad women. His good women behave in very specific ways.
Yeah.
Like they're supposed
so
to
true.
do certain things.
Yeah, that's fascinating, really. And one of my favorite observances as well in modern culture is how much we parallel the Victorians. Like, similar to the Victorians, most people alive and cognizant of life today, like, adults today, they moved through a really similar escalation of technology that the Victorians did. Like a Victorian, like I think of Maggie Smith in Downton Abbey. Like that show, of course, is post-Victorian, but she was very much a Victorian woman who, grew up in a time of candlelight. And by the time she dies, is going to, have lived through electricity, cars, 2 world wars. Like it's insane. It's insane. And we kind of went through something a bit similar. Like we have, no internet 50 years ago, 30 years ago, really at all. And then now we have social media and these little pocket computers and who knows what in the next 5 to 10 years. Like AI just sort of came out of nowhere as a consumer product, for example.
Right.
So that rapid industrialization, this kind of brings us into this medievalism movement and the way we have the cottagecore aesthetic today.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that's sort of funny about when we have like cottagecore or dark academia or some of these kind of aesthetics now that are, if they're not explicitly Victorian, they're like very Victorian tinged. You see a lot of Victorian stuff when you see those aesthetics. And it's funny because the Victorians, like they had their own version of that, which was this kind of, it's termed medievalism, and it shows up in like culture. It shows up a lot in poetry and art. But the Victorians became very interested in Arthurian legend, to a degree also like Shakespeare, but Shakespeare obviously was post-medieval, but this kind of Shakespeare and back, and especially a real focus on kind of the age of chivalry and, Arthurian legend, medieval royalty, and kind of the legends of Britain, especially. Medievalism was a very UK-based phenomenon. You don't see it as much. You see it in the US because they're influenced by the UK, but it was very much like the UK looking backward to,
the good old days.
England. Yeah. And medievalism is fascinating because there's also obviously nostalgia is complicated, right? And it's a form of nostalgia. And, sometimes nostalgia can be harmless and sometimes it can be harmful. And definitely with Victorian medievalism, I think there can be an edge of like, they're this massive world empire and they're almost looking back to like good old Britain or something. There's an edge to it that can definitely, scholars have pointed out, like an edge of xenophobia, or racism, or those, and definitely classism, right? Because they're always talking about like the Arthurian queens and whatnot, never the Arthurian peasants, always the Arthurian royalty. So it has that classist, racist, xenophobic kind of thing going on, for sure. But then also for them, I think, again, it's another response to the technology, and it's another way of kind of like, I think we naturally become nostalgic when we're sort of overstimulated, and new technologies and overcrowding that can really
the enclosure acts.
Yeah, it can be deeply, deeply overstimulating. And so in addition to all of the like, yucky, aspects, I think it's also just a response to feeling very kind of overstimulated by a culture that seems to be moving very quickly and is increasingly industrialized. And it is funny because we have now cottagecore and Victorian whatever, and they had medievalism. So, and the same, people have leveled kind of the same critique sometimes at like dark academia or cottagecore that you could also level at medievalism, which is, aspects of it can be harmless, but then also people have written about like dark academia, for example, can really be used to sort of glorify like British boarding school culture, which has, it can exclude people of color, that kind of thing. And same thing with cottagecore. And so there's this way in which both of them, like they have a similar impulse and they have a similar kind of purpose that they serve for people, but then they also have similar shadow sides in a way. And they share a lot of the same critiques, I think.
It's funny because we use images of the pre-Raphaelite artists, especially the ones who, like my favorite, Waterhouse, who would paint the witches. Oh my gosh. Actually, I always wanted the Lady of Shallow on my wall. And I happened to walk into an antique store once, and for $50, I mean, this was like a huge framed piece.
Oh,
it was
my
like
God.
massive. So I have that beauty, and it is like my prized possession. Like if there's a fire, that's the one.
Excellent choice.
I love his work. And like he did Circe as well, I believe.
Yeah.
And I think people call it Hecate. I don't know that he necessarily intended Hecate, but where she's holding like the ancient Greek rhabdos, like the long wand, and she's in front of the cauldron, the long brown-haired woman.
Yeah, that might be, he might call it, I've seen, if it's the one I'm thinking of, I've also seen it called the Magic Circle, if it's the one I'm thinking of.
Yes, I think that's the proper name. Because if you look up, it's funny if you go on like Google image and you type in Hecate, that's one of the first few pictures that comes up, which is funny. But yeah, there's so much great art that witches identify with today. Do you think they had any sort of were they like, oh, this is empowering for women, or is that just an accident that we feel empowered by these images?
That's like a really interesting question because, the Pre-Raphaelite, because these artists, they're part of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and then later incarnations of the Pre-Raphaelites later throughout the century. And their vision of women is like really, I talk about it a bit in the book, but it's really complicated because they're painting a lot of sorceresses like Circe, for example, who are like, if we were just talking about middle-class mother angel in the home, like total opposite of that, right? Circe's having affairs. She's turning men into pigs. She's running her own island. She never gets punished at the end, which for the Victorians, a lot of times, like the fallen woman gets punished.
The moralism,
Circe, exactly. So Circe never gets punished, anything like that. Medea is another one who they paint a lot, and Medea is like the ultimate like figure of like transgression of like maternal duty and everything. So on one hand, they're painting them and they're not painting them as monsters, right? Which is really, for the Victorian era, that's really interesting because if you think about, how the Victorians tended to feel about like women who weren't sufficiently womanly or, motherly, they used words like unnatural or monstrous or, but these paintings, they paint these characters as protagonists, right? They paint them, they look beautiful, they look enticing, they look interesting. So that seems very empowering, but they also have a kind of other fixation, and that's with kind of like the lady you're talking about, or Ophelia from Shakespeare, who's the other one I talk about in the book. They have a real fixation with like the tragic dead woman, right? Which is this kind of like beautiful, tragic, doomed, dead, young, lovely, which it's much harder to kind of like say, okay, that's clearly empowering in any way, and so
consumption core.
Yeah, exactly. It's like she looked out the window and then she died. Lesson:
wasting
don't look
diseases.
Out the window. Keep weaving. Don't go anywhere. So it's really hard because there's such a, if you look at the characters that they're painting, it's like everything from like she murdered her family and got away with it. She turned men into pigs and had a great time, all the way over to like she spoke up once and then died a horrible death or something, So I think they were exploring these questions of women and empowerment. It's hard to place them kind of in one camp or the other, really, I think.
Are you enjoying the show? If you are, we'd really appreciate a 5-star review. It helps us to reach more listeners like you and to keep doing the Magic Kitchen podcast. Thank you. Do you have any further reading recommendations for listeners who really want to keep diving into this topic of Victorianism, spiritualism?
Let's see. I list a few in the book. Let me think very quickly off the top of my head. A massive book stop it's an academic book by Janet Oppenheim, The Other World, Spiritualism and Psychical Research in England, 1850 to 1914. This is a big one. It's 500 pages, really dense. But there's Radical Spirits by, I think, Anne Broad, which is a really interesting look. I think she focuses a bit more on Americans, but it's like spiritualism and women's suffrage. That's really interesting. Amy Lehman has Victorian Women in the Theater of Trance, which is really fascinating. And that was a big source for the trance chapters in my book. Otherwise, I would just say, I'm sure there are others I'm not thinking of, but I would just say most of the original sources I cite, some of the newspapers are hard to get to if you don't have institutional affiliation, but the books are pretty much all available through either Project Gutenberg or Internet Archive. So definitely, if you're interested, if anyone out there is interested in sort of, you don't even have to read all of one, but just seeing how they describe it in their own words. Oh, and the creator of Sherlock Holmes, Doyle, he did a really great history of modern spiritualism. It's big, it's 2 volumes, but it's like Doyle writing his history of modern spiritualism, and it's great. It's a fun, it's a very lively read, and it's really fun to see the creator of Sherlock Holmes diving into a 2-volume history of spiritualism. So that's a cool one to check out.
Awesome.
Love that. I think there's a video of him, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, on YouTube, talking about spiritualism. I think I went down that rabbit hole when I was reading the book.
Oh my!
What a character.
He was multifaceted to the max. Such a complicated person. He was, and really prolific. He wrote everything. So, yeah.
And there's so many fascinating elements in this book. And for being a smaller book that you wrote, I like the florography. That one I just had to go back to because I was reading, the different language of flowers, and because I work so closely with flowers and herbs, I was like, oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
So I encourage everyone to get a copy of this book because it's so chocked full of the rabbit holes you can dive into as little segments in here.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
And how can our listeners keep up to date with you, and where can they get your book?
So the book should be available. It's available ebook, print, and audiobook. So it's available wherever books are sold, basically. I use the username Steele Arcana, so SteeleArcana on most platforms. I'm going to be actually, you know what? By the time this comes out, I will be active again. In the time between this episode and this episode actually coming out, I've got some academic work to do, so I'll be a little quiet. But by the time this episode comes out, I will hopefully be much more active on social media again. So I'll be on Instagram. I have a Facebook page. I should be more active on there by the time this comes out. And I may experiment with TikTok. I have no idea how that'll go, but I may give it a whirl. But I can be found as Steele Arcana on any of those platforms.
All right. Thanks for being here, Steele. It was really great to chat with you. I feel like we could talk all day about this.
I really think we could. all the many places we could go with this book. And
thank you so much.
Merry meet,
merry part, and merry meet again.
Thank you for joining us on the Magic Kitchen podcast. Please visit my website, leandrawitchwood.com, for news, information, and more episodes.
I'm Elise Wells, and I can be found at Seeking Noumena on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, and seekingnoumena.com.
That's Seeking, Numina.